Hello, welcome to History Now. Today we're going to talk about historical documentaries, and I'm delighted to welcome Deaglan Ó Mocháin from Dearcán Media, who's here to talk about his documentaries on the IRB, Michael Davitt and others. Deaglan, thanks for coming in. Your organisation that you're involved with, Dearcán Media, is that how I pronounced it right?
Yeah, that's
Dearcán
perfect.
Yeah. Can you give us a bit of background about that and what you do with it?
Sure, it's a Derry-based Irish language television company, and we've been on the go about 10 years. So Dearcán Media, not highly imaginative, it's Dearcán is an acorn, so we did a bit of market research and we come up with this great idea. We set it up in 2010, and since then we've been making mainly historical, cultural, social documentaries in the Irish language with TG Ceathair, BBC, the odd time for RTE. So we've been kept reasonably busy since then.
And you're a producer with it, yeah?
I'm mainly a producer. I've been dipping my toe and doing a bit of directing over the last few years. I wouldn't claim to be a director at all, but as a producer, they're generally speaking, I come up with the proposals and the concepts and take them to the broadcasters and see if we can get some interest in the sort of ideas that we're interested in as a company. And
as you say, you do historical documentaries, programming and that there. Could you give us a couple of examples of previous historical documentaries? Sure. The very first one we did was called Tubash the Ballywanis, the Ballymanis disaster. So that was a Donegal-based documentary about a sea mine explosion in the 40s in Donegal. It killed 19 young lads just beside Annagry, a place called Ballymanis. And I had lived in Donegal and I hadn't heard about this, and that was sort of what intrigued us about it.
Ballywanis. Balla farin chasfarige an wala dú an ggéilteacht ghunangáil. Dúige eileanne ton nach bhfuil muintear na héite álachar. Creidir na coideachú sin ggólan éileacht sin trúilíthe bhalla ag tragaid bhiltena a tharla insin I mí na beltaine 1993. Tragaid a bhfuil cimhne go dtí an leithniú hain. Tragaid darla maran nar cheart tarlú chorrbí agus na darla so
that's maybe a good example of the type of thing we're interested in. Maybe something that people might have heard of, but maybe wouldn't have a lot of information about. Subsequent to that, we did a documentary about Bram Stoker, again, for the sort of same reasons. I'll not go through them all, but there's a theme I think runs through a lot of them. We would take somebody like Bram Stoker, who people would know, possibly know that he's the author of Dracula. They might know he's from Dublin, and that might stop there. And then we like to dig a little bit and try to uncover things about them that are relevant, true Irish as well, so that sometimes opens up the possibilities for us to have a more interesting discussion, to approach Bram Stoker, or we did Robert Burns, to approach them through Irish. It gives you a different perspective on them at times because you're tapping into different experiences and different historians who have a different take on it. Or if we look at, say, the suffragette movement in Ireland, I was just struck by how few people knew Hannah Sheehy Skeffington. People would have known who Markovitz was, but people wouldn't have known who the key feminists were from that period. And that's another example of the type of documentary we like to get a grip on and use it maybe to explore 1916 from a left field perspective, from the perspective of feminists in Ireland.
Ein áit sa star, ein ceart atáige, ein drám, Deaglan Ó Mocháin, trí strachel.
If we're talking about democracy or national self-determination, women needed to be part of this democratic change that was going to be taking place.
That's what I was going to say about the Robert Burns. So it's not necessarily Irish historical documentaries, but it's through the medium of Irish.
It was Burns and his influence in Ireland, but of course we had to explore his biography as well. So I was interested in Burns. I had done an Ulster Scots documentary quite a while back, one of the first things that I had worked on. And I was interested in Burns, and I knew that he had, or there was an affinity with Burns in the Donegal Gaeltacht, and I knew a few Irish language lecturers in Irish literature who were interested in Burns, and it's that experience, that sort of migrant worker experience through music and culture, that they had a really interesting take on Burns and his impact. The other way we sort of turned it slightly is that we were looking at Burns as a musician, so it was actually a music program. Burns considered himself a musician, primarily, not a poet, which is that's the sort of thing that intrigues me. I think I heard that comment from somebody in the Ulster Scots programme, a guy called Fred Freeman, and that intrigued me and made me want to dig around a little bit more and speak to people who were also interested in burns and were able to expand on that. And that's generally the germ of an idea usually comes from hearing somebody say something quite interesting.
One I saw that you were involved with was the documentary on John Philip Holland, who was the inventor of the submarine. Now, I don't think there's too many people would know that, even within Ireland. What was the genesis of that one?
Well, that's a good question, actually, because I think that I was interested in that emerged also from a different documentary that I've been working on, or some research that I've been working on, and then I found out that a company was interested in doing the documentary as well. I had picked up a little bit about John Philip Holland from a traditional song about him that Michael Russell had written, so I was sort of intrigued as well. He's the inventor of a submarine as opposed to the inventor of the submarine, as people are quick to point out. People like to jump on sort of loose comments from time to time. But it's a great story. A Clare-born former Christian brother who built the first functioning submarine for the US Navy, but had made a working submarine for the IRB in America with the intention of attacking the British Navy in the 1860s. And we made the point in the documentary, this is around the same time that Jules Verne was writing 20,000 Leagues Under. So it's pure science fiction. It's maybe hard for us sometimes to appreciate just how radical an idea that was, and just how skilled an engineer John Philip Holland was. So that's a classic one for us in a way. Some people might have heard of it, and we went into a lot of detail to try and capture. I mean, we had to try and recreate the inside of a submarine, for example. The production team it was directed by Armagh, one of the Valleys from Armagh, MacDara Valley, who's based in New York, and he had a particular interest in the story as well. So we managed to build a production around that. That was a great project to work on. A really interesting topic.
Dinne milse na cliste fear commasach a fion Holland. Rinse rud na gro dinner biela abaldi anu.
John Holland has a place front and center in the history of submarines. He started it all.
Dala a Aragon, bhí ó scéal Holland faoi Celch. Tá sé an am dúinanis tomú go dóin an san amata chaite. Agus fear scéal, John Philip Holland a Amshu.
After you've chosen the topic, where does it go from then in terms of who you bring on board, and is it in a certain way based on already existing research that's out there, or do you ever find that you've got this new research that nobody's been looking at yet? You know? There's
always an interest in finding something new and different, but if you look at the topics like Bram Stoker or Robert Burns, you know, they're reasonably well known and reasonably well researched, but you're always interested in, again, I think coming at it from an Irish language point of view can sometimes open up a new way of looking at, for example, Bram Stoker's novel. There are references in it to his Irish upbringing that nobody would understand unless you were from Ireland. So one of the characters is called Lucy Westenra, and one of the leading Stoker scholars was speculating that is this a reference to the West End of London, or is anybody? I'm from Monaghan, so that the hotel, one of the landed gentry, one of the largest families of landed gentry in Monaghan are the West Enders. There's a West Ender hotel right across from the courthouse where Stoker used to work as a court reporter. So you're introducing something very different and a new reading maybe that other people might miss out on. The process is you approach the broadcaster and the funders initially, and then if they say we're interested in John Philip Holland as a concept, come back with a little bit more development. Then you go off and do some research around what's been written previously. Are there any sort of experts already out there, people who've written about this or have spoken about this? There's usually something. We're usually coming at it with a bit of background knowledge. And then in the case of John Philip Holland, we went to the archives ourselves as well and got what we could there. We got a lot of help and support from people who'd already done a lot of this work. So they were centrally involved in the programme from the start. Then my job would be to try and create a script that would work for a broadcaster. And so everything's filtered a few times. It'll be filtered through the experts, if you like, people who know this stuff. Then I have to take that and make it a viable television production idea. So the broadcasters will filter that again, because they'll have an idea that you have to take say a book and make it a visual story. That's your job, is to make a visual take of a written text. That probably describes what we do quite well.
So just to follow up on that aspect of things, your John Philip Holland, the current projects, Michael Davitt, and then we'll go on to the IRB. But you know, you're all talking about the 19th century. How do you go about, you know, finding sets, and then of course costumes? Because you know, obviously you have to make things look authentic.
It can be a tricky part of the process. There was a documentary we did, and it went down quite. The suffragette documentary we did went down quite well, but there was a reviewer who made a comment about a crummy reconstruction, and I remember thinking, right, that's never going to happen again. There's a reason why that one was. We were drawn on there was like a public event around the centenary of a suffrage march in Belfast, and people were invited to turn up, and so people were in a mishmash of costumes. We used a bit of that in the documentary, and we had no real control over. We had a bit of control over it, but it looked crummy, as the guy said. And I remember thinking, right, we have to up our game a little bit here. There's a couple of good resources in Derry that we draw upon quite a lot. There's an old stately home called Prehane House, and it's a walk-in set from anything from the 1860s up to the 1950s. It's just fantastic. And that turns up a lot in our reconstructions and in other people's reconstructions. The costumes, you have to go around, put ours in charity shops. There's some good props people in Belfast and get specialised props if you need them. The submarine one was a particular challenge. We had to recreate the inside of a submarine, and you have to be creative. Their budgets aren't massive for these types of things. There's a high expectation out there. People are raising Game of Thrones or Downton Abbey or whatever, and there's an expectation that this will look good. I mean, really, you want somebody to watch your documentary and they'll never say, oh God, that's terrible, or you know, that should never have been in there. You want it to look authentic and that people don't think about it. They're just watching the scenes unfold. So the submarine was built around a newly installed heating system next door in a church where I work, in the Cultalan in Derry next door. And we brought in a person who's good around art and props, and he recreated the inside of a submarine based on old drawings that we got from a newspaper report that had been written about John Philip Holland. So it's really oxygen tanks and dials and gauges. And, I mean, it's really hung together with gaffer tape and bits of wire and things like that. But it works when you have we had a really good DOP working on it, a really good camera operator. It's all about the lighting and the atmosphere and the sound, and the whole thing worked really well. Not because of me, in spite of me, I would say.
So the current two projects, we'll just start with the Michael Davitt one, which was it April or May it came out?
It came out in May.
Right, and it's fantastic. I watched it, the first showing of it. Michael Davitt is a very interesting character to cover. There's a lot to his life. Can you tell us about that documentary?
Sure. Again, Davitt's somebody I knew from school. I always loved history. But what did I know about Michael Davitt? I knew where he was from. I knew that he'd lost an arm in an accident. I knew that he was involved in the Land League. Beyond that, I knew very, very little, actually. I'd say in that case, I picked up a biography of Davitt and just thought, I wonder, has that been done? I would sort of check then online or on YouTube, has anybody made a Michael? Because sometimes you have a great idea and like somebody's actually just got it last year or somebody's commissioned to do it. So that there hadn't been a Davitt documentary done from the 80s. RT had done a documentary. And to be fair to TG Carr, they jumped at it too. They were very, very supportive. You know, there was never any issue about is this a good idea or a bad idea. So then the task is just to make it work. How does it work? What are the aspects of Davitt's story that we can visualise then? And in that case, I approached Lawrence Marley quite early on. Lawrence is a more recent biographer of Davitt. Carla King is a recent biographer of Davitt. Prior to that, T.W. Moody had written a pretty big volume on the early part of Davitt's life. I mean, that's a good example of this sort of the cut and thrust maybe of some of these debates, and we were also down at the Davitt Museum in Strayed where he was born, and they were really, really helpful. Just to see artifacts, you're talking about things being authentic, just to see artifacts of his life, things that he had donated or the family had donated, that was really helpful to us when we were trying to recreate what it might have looked like, or suits of clothes or banners that people might have carried. And one of the dilemmas we faced was how to tell the later life of Davitt. Davitt's life up to the sort of Land League and then becoming a parliamentarian. He'd been in prison, he'd lost his arm. These are all very visual motifs. You could get excited thinking about, I'm going to have, you know, it's a great challenge, but a really interesting challenge to capture that. Thereafter, he goes to Australia, he goes to Scandinavia, he goes to Russia. Like, what do we do? Do we show him wearing an Australian hat with corks on it? You know, it became a bit of a struggle then to think of how to visualise that. You can have him in his studio or in his office writing letters. That'll only take you so far. So there's a little bit of a weakness in David in that sense. We did concentrate on the big stories, the big part of his life, the sort of the more visually arresting parts of his life. So we took it in a we didn't intend to shoot it chronologically, but it sort of made sense the way that we decided to. It's very, very rare I would use actors with lines, and this is a rare example of a script. When we were introduced to a really top-class actor. We normally choose people, sometimes strangers on the street, with a really interesting look, or who look like Frank Sheehy Skeffington. We just grab somebody and say, would you be interested in doing a couple of days work for us in a documentary? And we've been really lucky with everybody that we've asked. They've been fantastic. So in this case, Sean O'Tarpey was approached to take on the role, and he had a couple of months to prepare, and he was brilliant. He brought things to the role that only Mayo people would understand. He spoke in Mayo Irish. He spoke the Irish that David would have spoken. He gave a really good interpretation of his character and his mannerisms based on what we had seen in terms of how David was described by others. So, I mean, that's the bit I really enjoy, I have to say. I love research, and I love trying to visualise a character and how to get the most out of a scene. Thereafter, I'm not technically gifted at all. I rely on the skills of others to bring that to life.
But you mentioned Carla King there, and she did a biography of him about 20 years ago, in 1999. She features in the documentary, she speaks in it, so that gives it a bit of authenticity then, do you think? Yeah.
That's very important, for sure. We, as a company, generally we don't editorialise, so we don't use VO unless we really have to. The only time we might use a VO is if we need to keep a certain proportion of Irish in every programme we do, 70-80% in Irish. And sometimes the topic doesn't lend itself to that. So Bram Stoker is a good example of that. We did have plenty of Irish, but you might introduce a VO there, and it allows you to sort of control the narrative a bit more. In the case of the David documentary, we want people to speak for themselves, and Carla's a great example of that. She knows David's life inside out, so we were able to build a lot of the programme around her expert contribution. It's far better for somebody like Carla, Garage O'Tuohy, Fergal McCluskey, people like that, Dara Folden, people who are doing research, recent research, PhD students. We always try to get a mixture of older established historians with maybe ones that aren't as well known, as well as gender balance. And these would be the sort of maybe characteristics that you're trying to always have in every documentary. I think it adds authenticity to it, and we don't editorialise. We do in the edit, of course, we're making decisions, but we always try to allow people to speak for themselves and that they'll explain David's life on our behalf for the audience, rather than somebody like myself writing a voiceover that sort of shapes the narrative.
There's a very interesting theme in the David documentary, and it's his journey from physical force nationalism to, you know, not pacifism, but, you know, more constitutional methods. That takes place, you know, it's over a period of time, but you have to get that all in. There's so much in David's life, and I really think that the documentary covers it well without getting the feeling of it being rushed. Is that a problem that you, when you're reading it, you know, you think, you know, there's a lot to cram in here, how are we going to...
Well, Carla's book's massive, and the T.W. Moody book's massive, and Lawrence Marley's book is really thorough and really well researched, and sometimes it's a bit of a dilemma. Sometimes the people who know most about your character aren't always the best contributors because they know so much and they want to get it all out, and they're really interested or really excited to try and squeeze everything in. In some ways, the visual medium, why I got into documentaries in the first place at all, is that I think it allows you to, it really makes you concentrate. We had 50 minutes to tell the story of Michael Davitt, like a really interesting character, a pivotal character in Irish history. That's really challenging. Now, sometimes when you're in that process, you think you'll never get to your 50 minutes because it's quite tricky to get it all sort of balanced out. So it can concertina a little bit, and using actors and using scenes like that allows you to shift, 20 years in a way that people won't question, because you can show, as we did, we showed a young actor playing David who'd lost an arm, being patched up by a doctor, and the next David we see is the young radical, the young IRB activist being arrested. And those little scenes speak for themselves. They can cover an awful lot of ground, I think, hopefully emotionally as well as factually. And then we're trying to represent that journey. We thought the best way in this case was to do it through the script. rather than have him, what's he going to do, like flounce or say, I think violence is terrible, or we had him explain. We used the journalist as a motif for people who haven't seen the documentary. We used the journalist, which was based on a genuine encounter that happened towards the end of David's life, where a journalist interviewed him about his life's work, and we did it as an Irish language journalist. David did have Irish. We had to establish that quite early on. And David explains that, as you're saying, he wasn't a pacifist per se, but I think he realised when he was in prison himself that he wasn't able to do much. He felt very frustrated. Somebody of his talent and capability felt that he'd wasted 7 years in prison when he could have been out organising the people. And so they're his words and his experience. It's not us saying we're reading David's mind here. He never denied. He felt that he was a Fenian to the end, but that the methods always had to have a moral core. He was that type of a moral Republican. These debates have happened since, and they're still happening to some extent. What is the moral grounds for armed struggle or for taking on imperialism? And you might think, I suppose part of what the documentary is trying to do is to say, in the face of the might of the British Empire and the powers of colonialism and imperialism, you're actually left quite a large moral space that you can occupy in terms of how you resist that. And that gets tightened when civilians get killed, or when people, various things happened that David was involved in and other people were involved in that created moral problems for the IRB. He maintained his membership when he got out of jail, but he was very soon sidelined because of his interest in developing alternative methods that brought the people to the fore and minimised the use of violence. So we were trying to address those issues visually.
So the next documentary, the one that's coming out next week, it's very complementary to the David one because you're dealing with some of the similar themes. But as you said there's a lot to cram into David's life. There's even more to cram in on the IRB one, because you're going back to the 1850s right through to 1922. What problems did that one cause?
Oh, it's the same dilemma. We decided, it was a bit of a fluke that we got the two documentaries commissioned side by side. That wasn't a plan, but we did shoot them as sort of sister documentaries because David was in the IRB, because he could explain a good chunk of that. And then the IRB can explain the consequences of the work of David. David created the social conditions that allowed the political revolution to take place that the IRB had been involved in behind the scenes. So the way we addressed that was by focusing on the key characters in each period, or the ones that we consider to be the key characters. So James Stephens, one of the founders, in the next period. Well, John Devine sort of straddles an awful long period, so he pops up a couple of times. Tom Clark represents that bridge between David-type Fenianism in 1916, and we tried to use him and Sean McDermott. I suppose the key thing for us was to reframe 1916 away from Patrick Pearse, away from James Connolly, and more towards the real instigators, Tom Clark and Sean McDermott, and deal with the issues of, again, the moral issues that creates, I suppose, the nature of a conspiracy versus the nature of an open political conspiracy, if you like, and whether it's ethical or whether it's moral to do that. And I suppose we made it really clear, David addressed this, that David was exposed by an agent, and Tom Clark was exposed by an agent, and David actually worked, I think, to expose an agent in the heart of the American bombing campaign as well. So I think that probably explains why the IRB went down the sort of super conspiratorial route that they did to allow them to do 1916. But the cost of that was, the cost of conspiracies is always that people are left on the outside. So we're trying to address that, and trying to address partition as well as the sort of maybe the breach in the relationship between the IRB and the Irish people, where they maybe can be absolutely criticised for the, I personally look on, as somebody from Monaghan, I look on partition as an abomination, and the IRB had a core role in it. My own granddad was involved in the IRA in the 20s, very much a Collins person, very much pro-treaty, became a blue shirt. So we were trying to tease out the origins of these two conservative entities that developed in 1920 and 1922 through the eyes of the IRB.
So there's a very interesting point, and it's something that you bring up, is the IRB's role around the treaty debates. Can you give us just a brief sort of background to that? And there's a thing where it's in the documentary where it's really, that's the end of the IRB.
it's almost the end as far as we could portray it. I think the last reference to the IRB was in the 60s, where Kathleen Clark helped fund the Wolfe Tone statue in St Stephen's Green with what was remaining of IRB funds from the 20s, which is quite interesting in and of itself. But the end point of the IRB really came, I think, when people tried to embrace the spirit of Michael Collins as they saw it within the Free State environment, and people in the Free State environment at that time who were in power, who were quite socially conservative, and who were quite a lot of them had come through the IRB ranks. They understood implicitly the danger of having the IRB continuing to exist in the Free State system. I think they decided to consolidate power and to cast out any remaining sort of overlap with the methodology of the IRB from the past. So people were forced to take sides. People had already been forced to take sides, the old Dev versus Collins debate. We didn't really get into that other than to say that Collins was clearly a very efficient military leader, and part of that mystique was based around his skills at conspiratorial methods that he had learned as a youngster in the IRB, and that created problems. It created democratic problems after the 1918 election. You know, who really controlled, who was running the show, who was pulling the strings. People weren't necessarily always clear. You know, long-standing Republicans or Republicans of good stature locally weren't always clear. You know, where was the real power base? You know, there's lots of stories of Collins meeting the area executive and then having a separate IRB meeting prior to it and after it, and sort of it seemed clear that there was a point reached where a decision had to be made between the sort of conspiratorial methods of the IRB or going under the sort of democratic influence of the Free State. If that even makes sense in the context of partition, but that there was a demarcation, there was a point reached where people had to choose north or south. And in the north, they went with Collins as the person that they trusted, somebody that had stood up for them and was providing weapons. There seemed to be a sense that we'll never let you down. But then, of course, they were let down. And with the death of Collins, I think it's all speculative now whether or not he would have ever tried to reignite the sort of comradeship that existed between himself and his fellow sort of IRB members in an attempt to sort of undermine the existence of the North.
What's next? You know, there's a really great body of work here that you're building up, Dave. You have any projects in the next while?
It's historical in a way. We're shooting a documentary about Gaeltacht fishing village in Donegal in Maharoti. It's just the tradition of fishing there, and there's very little of it left compared to 20, 30 years ago. So in some ways, I almost see that as historical. So we've been doing a little bit of filming on Irish-speaking crews going out doing deep-sea fishing. I mean, they're great characters. They're fantastic. So there's a commentary there maybe on aspects of the EU and of Irish fishing policy and whether Gaeltacht communities are receiving fair play. I mean, it's an interesting project. We did a sort of slightly historical project on the Donegal fiddling tradition. There's a 40th anniversary of a book called The Northern Fiddler, and we're doing a sort of like an update on that. We're looking at what the state of the fiddle playing tradition in Ireland from the point of it was in sort of real danger 40 years ago to sort of, a very strong tradition now. So again, culture, politics, commentary on society, it's all right up our street. You know, so that's what we're at the minute, and already planning for next year, the year after that. That little book is always filling up with ideas.
Great stuff. Deaglan, thanks very much for coming in.
So thanks for having me on the show.